Do all the drugs you can get, as large a doses all the time. It will fix you.
Welcome to the Greener Grass podcast from BlueBird Botanicals. I'm your host, Lex Pelger. Adam Strauss is one of my favorite people to hear talk about psychedelics. He's a gifted presenter and stand-up comedian whose one-man show, The Mushroom Cure, is a powerful piece of performance. It's the true story of how he used magic mushrooms for his obsessive-compulsive disorder. I won't give away the end of the show, but it's a fascinating story. Adam tells it with humor and emotional honesty. He's not a utopian promising that psychedelics are a panacea, and he wants you to know that this is anecdotal and very personal, but also transformative. I hope you enjoy hearing from Adam Strauss, and I hope you get to see his show someday. As you'll hear, he's in New York City for another month, and we hope there will be a film version of The Mushroom Cure made soon. Here's Adam. This show is brought to you by BlueBird Botanicals, to spread education about cannabis and other things on the greener side of life. BlueBird CBD oil comes from farms in southern Colorado and is grown using only water, soil, and sunlight. Go to bluebirdbotanicals.com for more info. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with my friend Adam Strauss, who is known far and wide for The Mushroom Cure, among his other work. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Lex. I mean, I don't know how far or wide I'm known, but I suppose if I am known for anything, it is probably The Mushroom Cure. So yeah, glad to chat with you.
Great. And so before we get to the psychedelic side of things, I want to know more about you and comedy. Did you always know that you wanted to be a comedian and this world made sense to you?
No, I didn't. I've had a pretty circuitous path, really, in everything I've done in life, comedy included. So I had never, unlike most comics, I always loved comedy. It was something that I remember as a kid watching, like Comic Relief and stuff, and really loving it. But I was never a performer, so it just kind of wasn't in. For whatever reason, I didn't entertain it as a real possibility until there was a certain point in my life I'd had a relationship end, a particularly significant relationship, and I think that was part of it. I think I had been a musician, as a pretty serious musician. I almost got my master's in jazz studies, and then I dropped out, and then I'd stopped playing, and I felt the need to, I think partially as a result of this breakup, I really wanted to create. And I started playing music again, but it was a bit frustrating. I didn't know any musicians anymore in the New York area, or the ones I did know were, more successful and didn't want to start anything new. And so it was at this point of my life where I was looking for some sort of creative outlet that a friend brought me to my first live comedy show. So even though I loved comedy, it's New York is probably the comedy capital of the world, but the audiences are largely tourists. New Yorkers generally don't see a lot of comedy. And I'd lived in New York for years at that point, but I'd never actually seen a live stand-up show. And a friend brought me to a show for the first time, and it just sort of clicked that, hey, this is something that I could do and that I wanted to do. I think I was excited with music, I was a jazz musician. And what I loved about that was the idea that you're spontaneously creating within a certain framework. So you have a song, you have chord changes, but then you're also improvising. And I like the idea also that you were creating with other people, with the other musicians. In comedy, I think it hits some of those same marks in that, you have your material, you have your jokes, but you're going to riff off of those. And sometimes you're completely spontaneous, particularly when you're talking to the crowd. And then there is also an element of collaboration, not with other musicians or other comedians generally, you're up there alone, but with the audience, there really is a collaboration. It is a conversation. Their role typically is just laughter, but the rhythm, the quality of their laughter, the quantity of their laughter, that does inform your performance. So I didn't understand all of that at that point in time, but I think at a visceral sense, it just excited me that, I can create with other people and express myself in this way. So that's how it all started.
And what was it like to get started and to be up there with the naked microphone and all the expectant faces?
Well, there weren't that many expected faces when you start out. You're performing at open mics. It wasn't like there were big crowds. It was brutal. I mean, New York City is probably, I'd say it's the best and worst place to start comedy. It's the best place because the level of comedy here, I would argue, is better than anywhere. There's great comics all over the place, but in terms of the number of great comics, I don't think there's more anywhere than in New York City. So you learn from them. You can see great people any night of the week, but it's a double-edged sword because those people are also your competition. So if you start off performing in a smaller city, Boston, where I grew up, but I didn't do comedy then, the talent pool is a lot smaller. There's less competition. There may be less demand, but there's a lot less supply in terms of comics. So it's just easier to get stage time. New York, you're competing against all of the greats. So when you start out, you're really relegated to doing open mics where you're basically just performing for other comics who typically tend not to be a very charitable audience. It's often likened to, magicians doing magic for other magicians. Comics kind of know what you're trying to do. They know how the sauce is made, so they often tend to not be that impressed. And there's that acute competition when you're starting out. There is a great and supportive community of comedians, but I think at the very early stages, there's it's just so brutal, and so there's tends to be competition. So they're often not very charitable with their laughter. So it's a tough place to start out. And most people, I would say, 95% of the people who I started doing open mics with, if not more, don't do comedy anymore. So you have to have some real love of comedy, but you also have to have some sort of desperate need, I think, that propels you past the inevitable failures that you're going to have early on and keeps you doing this to the point that you can get good enough to actually start to make a living at it. So it was a rough education in the early days.
Speaking of comics, more as the species, what about the idea that you hear where they can often be some of the most sad people, just like the famous clown who was sad and told to go see himself? Do you see that among comedians?
Absolutely. Yes, I do. And it's I mean, I think there's two facets to that. I think one, what I just said earlier about you have to have some desperate need. That wasn't a joke. I really do think so. Comedy, laughter is incredibly reinforcing. What I mean by that is, to my knowledge, they haven't done MRI studies, fMRI studies of comedians, and what happens in their brains when audiences laugh. I'm sure they have not done that, but if they did, I would wager that you would see the brain light up in a similar pattern that you see, with a heroin addict when they're taking heroin. There really is the pleasure centers. It's got to be dopamine implicated there. The pleasure centers just light up, or it feels like that when you're on stage and you get laughter. But again, there's also, especially in the early days, a lot of humiliation, candidly, a lot of rejection. It does feel like a very personal rejection, especially when you're starting out. You've put all this time into this material, and the audience isn't laughing, or worse, they're reacting negatively. So again, I think most people who start out, they find the laughter is incredibly powerful and reinforcing, but the lack of laughter is incredibly painful, and so they quit. So to get past that pain, you really do have to have some need for that validation, that reinforcement that keeps you going through the rough times. And so I guess I'm saying, in a sense, I think there has to be some void you're trying to fill to do this. Now, maybe I'm just projecting my own experience. Maybe that's not true of all comics, but I don't know. Having met a lot of comics, I would say that they are trying to sate some pretty primal need in doing this, and of course, it doesn't work. And you realize that at a certain point, and that's okay, because then there's still I get a lot of joy from comedy, even though I know it's not going to save me or make up for the fact that I didn't have a prom date, or maybe my mother didn't hold me enough, or those sort of things. But so I do think there's some sort of need that comics have. Probably common to all performers, but the thing about comedy is it is so immediately reinforcing, right? If you're writing a book, I'm sure it feels good to read, positive reviews, and if you see it on the New York Times bestseller list, but that's a very delayed form of gratification. And one thing we know from addiction studies is the shorter acting a drug, the more addictive it is, right? Crack is a lot more addictive than powdered cocaine because it hits harder and it wears off more quickly, and you want to redose more acutely. So comedy, I would say, as an art form, I don't think there's any other art form where you're getting such immediate reinforcement as stand-up comedy. So it can be very, very seductive and addictive in that way. The other reason, though, I think comics are sad is It does. I sometimes wonder if there is something fundamentally unhealthy about comedy, and that you are training yourself to to um to in some sense value yourself based on how much laughter you get, right? Based on the reaction you're getting from the audience. I mean, if you look at sort of the cliche that's at the heart of, most philosophies and religions, is that happiness comes from within. But you're, as a comic, you're reinforcing precisely the exact opposite lesson, which is that no, happiness comes from the audience laughing at you and essentially telling you through laughter that they approve of you, that they love you, that they like you. And so I do think that you can get into this mindset where I think all humans look for approval from the outside. I mean, we're social animals, but I think it can heighten that for comics. And also there is the addictive aspect where, you're used to this high of laughter, and regular life can start to feel a little bit dull in comparison. So, yeah, so I think a lot of comics do struggle with depression, you know, various forms of psychological suffering.
Maybe that brings us to the mushroom work and how that might be applicable as you go out talking to people about psilocybin mushrooms. Do you hear much interest from your fellow comics with this?
Yes, I do. I mean, so the mushroom cure it's not stand up. I would call it comedy. It is comedy, but it's really more of a theater piece. It's me just telling the completely true story of how, I had really debilitating obsessive compulsive disorder for many, many years. I'd seen all sorts of specialists, been on, every possible prescription medication. And I really mean that. I mean, all the SSRI antidepressants, antipsychotics, lithium at one point, everything that could possibly work. The psychopharmacologists were just throwing stuff against the wall and seeing what would work. And the answer is nothing. Nothing was working. And then I read this study, to date, still the only study of psilocybin, or actually any psychedelic, for OCD. This was out of the University of Arizona, where they gave a small number of volunteers psilocybin, and they found that, yeah, it was quite effective with OCD. It was a very, very small study, and they weren't really looking at the long-term effects of it. But it turned out that at least one subject in the study they kind of followed up with, or I think he might have proactively followed up with the study, with the researchers. Anyway, 6 months later, this person was still basically symptom free, and everyone in the study did see a pretty significant reduction in symptoms, sometimes fairly short lasting. But I read that study, at this real low point with my OCD. And at that point, I did not have much psychedelic experience, but I figured, well, I don't have anything to lose by trying this. So I tried to cure myself. And so that's what the mushroom cure is. It's basically the story. The show opens with me reading that study, and then what happens next is the show. It's a 90-minute show, so it is a comedic show, but it's also pretty dark. I don't shy away from really depicting my suffering in a very open, vulnerable way. I think a lot of people who see the show, people often come up and say, "Yeah, I've never seen anyone be so open about their struggles on stage or off stage." So there was laughter, but there is often, sometimes audience members will cry, and I certainly try to really go back to those dark times in the performance. So a lot of my fellow comedian friends have been supportive and have seen the show, and have had positive responses to it. But it is a different sort of thing, and my agenda, I don't know if I love that term, but my goal maybe, sounds a little less Machiavellian in that show. It's not laughter. I mean, I want people to enjoy themselves. And the laughter comes because there are ridiculous and absurd situations that I recount. And OCD in and of itself, I mean, it's a deadly serious disease. 15% of people with OCD attempt suicide. There's this sort of popular conception that OCD is, well, it's this sort of lightweight form of mental illness, and that's just not the case. In fact, the prognosis by many measures for OCD, it's worse than depression. So it is a deadly serious disease. But also, it is kind of ridiculous and absurd. There is something comedic about repeating these, rituals again and again that aren't doing anything. So, yeah. So my goal in the mushroom cure is not to make people laugh. I want them to laugh. I want them to enjoy themselves, but really to take them through those experiences, and hopefully, really, the ultimate goal is to have them have their own experience, their own emotional experience, because I'm performing now in the theater I'm doing in New York City. It's 100 and I think it's 65 seats. And so, of 165 people, not that we always sell out, but let's say it's a sold out show, as well, statistically, 2% of the population has OCD. Um, Now, I think it's probably higher in New York, but the point is the majority of people in the audience are not going to have OCD, but many of them know someone with OCD. But even people who don't have any firsthand or secondhand experience with OCD, I think the struggle that I recount is in some sense universal, which is the struggle of really, trying to gain some freedom from ourselves. And by that, I mean, I think all of us struggle with developing patterns of behavior and thought, maybe at a very early age, maybe unconsciously, but we develop these patterns because we think they're going to protect us. We think they're going to keep us safe in some way or help us avoid suffering. And they may do that in the very short term. Like someone with OCD who engages in a ritual, they will feel better right after the ritual. Their anxiety will go down, but it may only go down for 10 seconds or 20 seconds, and they need to repeat the ritual. And I think, regardless of whether you have OCD, that pattern of doing something that may help in the very short term, but ultimately causes a lot more pain than whatever pain you were trying to avoid in the first place. I think that pattern is universal. And I think I illuminate that in this show. And so my goal is for people to really see that, maybe even see it in themselves, and connect to that universal suffering, but also the possibility of redemption. Now, in the show, I talk about trying to achieve that through psychedelics, but ultimately it's about having some sort of experience that connects us to something beyond ourselves, I think, which for some people could be religious, but doesn't have to be. It could be anything. It could be nature. It could be, but finding some way to break out of our sort of regimented, stagnated patterns of thought and behavior. And so that's really what I'm going for in that show, is to give people an emotional experience that they can relate to in some way.
So, what was it like for you to write this show, switching gears from comedy and also trying to get these really deep personal experiences into something that other people could relate to?
Yeah, it was. So I didn't really know what I was doing because I don't have an acting background. I have since started taking a few acting lessons, but at the time I'd never done any sort of acting, and I didn't really realize I was writing ultimately a play in a sense. Um, so when I first started, while I was going through these experiences, it really was life or death at times. There was a sense that I might not survive, that I might, suicide might be how this ends. But there was also a sense of, if I do make it through these experiences of trying to cure myself with psychedelics, I have to tell people about this, because even as I was going through it, I knew it was a pretty amazing story. The actual events as they were unfolding to me were pretty remarkable. So when I did survive, and I wanted to tell people about this, I first started trying to do it in more of a stand-up format. And I realized quickly that that wasn't going to work because there's just too much story there. Stand-up, there's an obligation to make the audience laugh, at pretty regular intervals, every 30 seconds or so. And that limits your ability to tell a lot of stories. So I realized this wasn't stand up. And so then I just sat down, and I didn't actually write it. I just started talking through it into a voice recorder. And it came out, I've written a lot of other stuff since. And I have to say, this in some ways was the easiest thing I've ever written, because the story itself has just a very natural arc to it. There's a very clear beginning, middle, and end. And I knew what the story was, just the way the events unfolded. And it just kind of poured out of me. So I wrote it pretty quickly, polishing it, and then, cutting it down, because there were a lot of experiences, a lot of psychedelic experiences, and making it into a 90-minute show, that took a lot of work. And I was aided greatly by, I started working with a director after I'd been telling the story for a couple of years, named Jonathan Libman, based in New York, who's just really a genius. And I don't use that term lightly. And so he helped a great deal in terms of editing the thing down. But yeah, writing it, I think in a way, now that the show's been going on for a while, and actors have seen it, and they've often commented, wow, you're so vulnerable up there. How do you do that? And I think the answer is ignorance. I think the fact is, I didn't really know what I was doing. I just knew I had to tell the story. So I didn't hold back. I didn't try for much craft or artifice. And I think a trained actor might have, in some ways, maybe shied away from it a little bit, or tried to shade some of the suffering with more craft. And I think that gives the story. I mean, if you look at the reviews, which have generally been positive, but some reviewers have commented that there is a certain rawness to the performance. And that's something that, as I've become more polished as a performer, I've taken pains to make sure that stays in there, because I want people, basically, when they see the show, I don't want them to think, oh, we're seeing, someone telling us about something that happened years ago. I want them to feel like, wow, this is happening now. This guy is experiencing this stuff now. And, that's, I think that also comes from the fact that this is a true story and one that connects to me. So I really, in writing the story and in telling it, I try to put myself back in that place and just kind of re-experience it.
That does make sense because it does feel like it's one of the most powerful parts of it. And one of the reasons I think it's so important to spread, because we did that psychedelic storytelling tour that was an open mic across the country.
Yeah,
And I was fascinated to hear how often OCD came up with stories that were
really.
really powerful and unexpected. And the one of the interesting parts to me was, with sometimes with psychedelics and mental health stuff, they can just really make that problem be much better more quickly. But that wasn't the case, it seemed like, with most of the OCD stories. It was people who knew that this was going to be a mountain to climb. And I remember one young woman, it was 20 sessions or something. And she finally took a mega dose at the very end and said, this will be the one that solves this for me. And it was.
Wow.
But it was very rarely a one time and things are better. It was more what you're talking about, of working towards a goal and knowing it's going to take a lot of work to get there.
Yeah, and to be fair, I mean, the way I approached it was not an intelligent way to do it. I did have precisely that view that, oh, this is going to be a one-time thing. Like, it was really this, actually a very OCD way to approach it, which is like, well, if I just control all the variables perfectly, if I have the right drug, the right type of mushrooms, take the right dose in the right setting with the right mindset, I'm going to get the right outcome. I'm going to cure myself. And I think psychedelics, certainly you do see that sometimes, especially some of the actual published research coming out for, MDMA for PTSD and psilocybin for end of life anxiety. People really do have these life-changing experiences, with one or two or sometimes three journeys. That was not the case for me. And in fact, I think part of the reason the show is entertaining and has some drama is because I didn't, I was doing this either with this, it was my girlfriend at the time, who I talk about quite a bit in the show, who was a psychologist who had sort of unintentionally and unexpectedly cured her own clinical depression with mescaline containing cacti. And I was sort of her unofficial research subject. So some of the journeys were with her, but some of them were alone. And I was doing, a lot of research chemicals, 2CE, 2CT7, 2CB, all of this stuff, different dose levels. I was doing it in a pretty frantic, desperate way. I mean, I was tripping every week, every other week, high doses, uncontrolled environments. And not surprisingly, I had some pretty harrowing experiences. And, but I think it is sort of the beauty of psychedelics, where one of those cliches that ring true to me is they don't give you what you want, but they do give you what you need. And in my sense, in my case, the sense I eventually came to was that I couldn't control this stuff, and it was really about surrender. And without getting into all the details of the show, one of the most valuable things I got from psychedelics was not just the understanding, but the visceral experience of surrendering, of being on, say, a very high dose of mushrooms, being terrified, trying to fight it, trying to control it, the same way I would do with, with the OCD. OCD is something, you have a thought you don't want, an obsessive thought, so you try to get rid of it by engaging in a compulsive ritual. It's all about control. And having this experience on psychedelics, where I realized, well, if I try to fight this, if I try to control this experience, I'm going to be in hell, maybe even literally hell. So the choice here is to surrender, is to let go, and to trust that somehow I'll make it through this. And having that experience of surrendering and letting go on psychedelics was critical, because then gradually I was able to do that when I was not on psychedelics. But it was certainly a long journey for me, and an ongoing journey. The show is called The Mushroom Cure because that's what I was looking for. But I don't want to spoil the show for anyone, but suffice to say, it was not a perfect cure for me. The OCD is a lot better, but I still do struggle with obsessive thinking, perfectionism, some of the sort of more subtle manifestations of obsessiveness. So it's it was a long road to get the recovery I've had, and the road continues.
So you probably get asked this a lot, but what advice would you give to other people out there who have OCD and are intrigued by these things you're talking about?
Do a lot of drugs. Do all the drugs you can get your hands on all the time. No, that would not be my advice, though. Candidly, that is sort of what I did. I did go. I don't want to say overboard, but I was desperate, and so I really did try everything I could get my hands on. My advice would actually be the opposite. Would be not to do what I did, but to do this in a more considered, intelligent way. So were I to do it again or advise anyone else, well, the first thing I would say is realize that yes, psychedelics do show a lot of promise with a range of conditions, but there's two caveats there. First of all, with OCD specifically, there's only been one completed study to date. That study I read out of the University of Arizona that was actually published in, I believe, December of 2006. And it was a very small pilot study, as I mentioned. There are now, encouragingly, two studies that are, I think they're enrolling subjects now, or they will be shortly. A follow-up out of the University of Arizona with the same researcher, Francisco Moreno, and Yale is doing some work, or is going to begin shortly doing some work. I believe these are both, by the way, backed by Hefter and USONA. But at any rate, so there are two studies that will hopefully be published within the next couple of years. But right now, there's only one very small study. But there is also a fair amount of anecdotal evidence that psychedelics can be helpful for OCD. Having said that, I mean, the thing, and people do ask me for advice often, and I tell them, realize that, and I'll talk in a moment about how, if you are going to do this, the more intelligent way to do it rather than the way I did it. But the ultimate caveat is psychedelics, they're not like other drugs, other substances, in that, alcohol, cocaine, you're going to get a fairly reliable effect. It may be somewhat changed by your mood and by the setting, but generally, if you have 6 glasses of wine, you're going to feel a certain way. If you do a gram of cocaine, you're going to feel a certain way. Psychedelics, it's wildly variable, even controlling as much as possible for set and setting. So the caveat is really, you can do everything quote unquote right. You can have a good setting, you can go into it with a good mindset. You can know the substance you're doing, its purity, its potency, and you can still have an unpredictable and potentially very challenging experience. So there's no guarantees with this stuff. Having said that, I don't think it's crazy. If you're suffering from OCD the way I was, I don't think it's crazy to try this route. What I would say is the best practices there is you want to replicate as closely as possible the protocols that are being used in the current wave of studies. And those studies they're not really psychedelic therapy, they're psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. And I think that's an important distinction. This isn't a case of, of researchers giving subjects psilocybin or MDMA or LSD and sending them home. This is the psychedelic experience is embedded in a broader context of therapy. So people are typically meeting with therapists multiple times before the drug experience, multiple times after. There's a lot of support for integration. So that's what I would try to replicate. One way to do this is there is a community of underground psychedelic guides. Michael Pollan has made a lot of people aware of this now with his new book, How to Change Your Mind. I actually recently worked with a guide in the Bay Area on a guided psilocybin journey. I shouldn't say psilocybin because it wasn't pure psilocybin. It was psilocybin containing mushrooms. And I found it to be very helpful. So that's one route. If you can find someone like that, that would be the first choice, I think. Obviously, that work is underground, and so it is hard to find people like that. If you can find someone like that and you are, set on trying this, again, I try to replicate what you read in these studies. So one possibility is there are therapists who they won't administer psychedelics to you, but they will work with you before and after. Ingmar Gorman here in New York has the Center for Optimal Living, which supports people in their psychedelic experiences. He's not an underground therapist. He's conducting some of the MAPS trials now, but he will, after the fact, help people integrate. So that's one resource potentially. Even if you can find someone like that, though, having even just a therapist, maybe one who doesn't have a lot of experience with psychedelics, you can give them some of the studies, maybe have them read Pollan's book so they understand a little bit, and so that you have someone who you can kind of talk to about the stuff afterwards. And ultimately, the old cliche set and setting, I think that really does hold true. You don't want to do this stuff if you've gotten some particularly devastating or upsetting news. You want to do it in an environment that's going to be conducive to you letting go. You obviously doing this, in public at a party would not be optimal if you're looking for therapeutic effects. And of course, know your drug, know what you're taking. Know its potency, and that may mean acquiring something from a reputable source, trying low doses, a few times to figure out the right dose. So I guess if you were to kind of wrap all this up, it's don't do this the way I did it in a sort of hell-bent, frantic way. Really take the time to set yourself up to have the best experience possible, which may still be a challenging experience. But I think if you control those variables as much as possible, you certainly increase the likelihood of having a positive outcome. And then the last thing I'd say is, this is not a silver bullet. Again, I mentioned earlier, the show is called The Mushroom Cure. That's what I was looking for. I would not consider myself completely cured from OCD. There's been some pretty dramatic improvement, but I would be realistic in looking at this as this is something that can be a key piece of your recovery, but it has to be supported with other things. So I still do other practices. I meditate regularly. I don't see a therapist regularly now, but I have, since the Mushroom Cure experiences, and ultimately lifestyle changes. All of that stuff can be very helpful. But yeah, I think in the right circumstances, psychedelics can be uniquely helpful for OCD and a range of other conditions.
I would be curious, after doing the show so many times, how much pushback you got from either members of the audience or maybe even people from the professional community that were worried about these things that you're talking about.
Yeah, I really haven't. I'm actually somewhat surprised how little pushback there's been. There really hasn't been any from audience members. There's been one of the early performances I did of the show. I got a particularly scathing review from someone who just was not open to the idea that psychedelics could help anyone, and in the review accused me of glorifying drug abuse, which, I mean, you've seen the show, is clearly not what I do. But that was a rare outlier there. I think there's a recognition even among people who may not have a lot of experience or any experience with psychedelics, that the current paradigm for treating mental illness just doesn't work. And this, I could go off into a whole rant here, but with OCD, the best data we have is about half of people with OCD don't respond to current pharmacotherapies. They don't respond to SSRIs and that sort of thing. And the half who do respond, they typically see only about a 25% symptom reduction. So most people with OCD are not helped significantly by current medications. Now, cognitive behavioral therapy can be extremely helpful for some people, but there are plenty of people like myself who have what's termed treatment-resistant OCD, and nothing really works. So I think there's an understanding, a growing understanding and acceptance that we need to explore new treatments. I mean, OCD it's devastating, and depression can be devastating, and addiction can be devastating, and PTSD can be devastating, just to mention a few of the conditions that are now being researched with psychedelics. So yeah, I was and still am somewhat surprised at how open people are to at least learning about this. Not that my show is primarily educational; it's an aesthetic experience. But you have to be, I think, to appreciate the show, you have to be at least open to the idea that yes, psychedelics can be helpful, and and it seems like most people are now.
And so it's a show that really plays off the audience. How did the show evolve for you from the beginning until where you are now with the responses from the audience you felt?
I would say the evolution of the show. So I started out doing it in comedy clubs, not so much as a show, just kind of telling certain, episodes, and the response was good. But what I found quickly was it was very hard to get in all the narrative that I wanted to get in a comedy club where people expect to laugh, at regular intervals. So, what I guess what I'd say is over time the show, and so then I started kind of going in more of a really trying to just communicate the experience as accurately as I can and as emotionally honestly as I can. I know we talked about this earlier. We're just kind of really putting myself back in there, the rawness of the experience. And that, is not something that's probably going to fly in a comedy club. So it started moving to theaters. And so over time, I'd say the response has changed, where before it was more of just a funny show. I think now it still is a funny show, if I do say so myself, but there's also a depth and a pathos to it. I don't shy away from my suffering. And so, the quickest way I could put it is people always laugh during the show. And again, I may have said this in our earlier segment that I don't quite recall. So they always laugh. But you also, I should clarify that somewhat. There may be some people who aren't going to laugh, but most of the audience is laughing, regularly throughout the show. But there also are some tears among some audience members. And in a sense, that's more rewarding for me, because I feel like, all right, I've given them a real emotional experience. I do just straight ahead stand up most nights at different comedy clubs in New York or San Francisco or LA, wherever I happen to be. And I love doing that. I love stand up. But this show to me is about really giving people a deeper, fuller experience. And yeah, I've been gratified because audiences really are willing to go there with me. I think they respond to the honesty and the rawness and relate to that.
For the future of the show, where could people see it? That'll be soon, and what other plans do you have?
We're playing in New York right now at Theater 80 St. Mark's, which, as the name implies, is on St. Mark's Place in the East Village. So we're just doing it once a week right now. We're doing it on Fridays at 7:30. We may have some Saturdays sprinkled in. And we're going to be there through early September, through September 7th. After that, this particular show may be retired. I'm going to be moving on. The reason I'm only doing it once a week now is I'm really focusing on writing a new show that will likely be premiering in San Francisco beginning early October. I would tell you what that show's about, but I don't know yet. The only way I can write something, and this was true of the Mushroom Cure too, the way I did it first. So I started, as I mentioned, I started kind of telling some of these stories in comedy clubs, and then I realized, okay, this is more of a theater show. So what I did is I applied to a festival, the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, not having written the show at all. It's a true story, so I knew what happened. I had an idea of what I wanted to talk about, but I hadn't really, didn't have any sort of polished material, and just ground it out over 3 or 4 weeks before that deadline. I think it's part of the, like I said, the OCD is dramatically better, but I certainly do, perfectionism is something I struggle with, and I think one of the results of that, procrastination can often stem from perfectionism, because it's like, well, if I can't get it right, I don't really want to do it. And so I am a terrible procrastinator, especially when it comes to writing. And I've done other shows since the Mushroom Cure, and I've found the only way I can really buckle down is when I have a date, when I'm like, all right, I have to go on stage at this theater on this date. Crap, that's in 3 weeks. I better get started. So that's what I did this time. I signed a contract to do a show in San Francisco starting early October, knowing I didn't have a show, but also knowing that that's the best way I'm going to get a show. So I don't have a title. I think psychedelics will be part of this show. I don't think it will be as psychedelically focused as the Mushroom Cure, but I think I'll probably touch on some of my ayahuasca experiences. I was in Peru a little bit more than a year ago, and drank 10 times over the course of 16 nights. And so definitely have some stories from there. But yeah, so my focus is likely going to shift away from the Mushroom Cure in the very near future. I say likely because, who knows if I get enticing offers from new theaters in new cities, I enjoy doing the show, and I would certainly bring it back. But for now, at least through early September, the show is playing in New York. TheMushroomCure.com will always have, current tour dates. Oh, and I might as well mention, the show is going to be in San Antonio. It's November. I don't remember the exact dates, but it's basically the weekend before Thanksgiving. It's like that Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Maybe it's November 14th, 15th, 16th, or something along those lines in mid-November. So as of now, those are the only plans for the Mushroom Cure. But I'll certainly be doing, be talking on stage and in various forms and saying different words for the foreseeable future in different places.
Well, I look forward to seeing more. And what the final question would be, when the Mushroom Cure comes to be filmed, who would be and they're going to put a big A-list Hollywood actor
right.
Instead of you. Do you know who that would be?
Who would be? Well, so in terms of celebrity comparisons, in terms of just my appearance, they range from Jeff Goldblum is one I get quite a bit. One of the less flattering ones, though I'm a big fan. The more flattering ones, who do I get? I get, Hugh Jackman, I get sometimes. Yeah, I would be happy with any of those. But also I think you'd want someone a little bit kind of intense and maybe a little bit unhinged, because certainly as you've seen the show, there are I don't shy away from showing my rather unhinged moments. So
Yeah, the person came to my mind was a young Jack Nicholson.
yeah, that would be yep, he could definitely pull it off.
Well, Adam, thank you so much, both for this conversation and for all the work in the mushroom cure. I think it's a really important piece of work that opened a lot of people's eyes, and I just want to say thanks for that.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Lex.
Greener Grass is a BlueBird Botanicals podcast. Their CBD oil supports a healthy body and a strong endocannabinoid system. They've got friendly customer service who can answer any of your questions, and the number is right there at the top of their webpage. But, per the FDA, they won't be able to make any medical claims for these nutritional supplements. That's also the reason you'll hear little about CBD on this show. There's no need for us to add more evidence about CBD when a simple Google search will give you more than you can read in a month of Sundays. So this show covers the cannabis world and more with editorial freedom from BlueBird Botanicals. Thanks for joining the Greener Grass podcast. As always, our audio alchemist is Matt Payne. The Gypsy Jazz theme music comes from Brett Van Donsel. Our beautiful bird sounds are courtesy of Lang Elliott. And I'm your host, Lex Pelger, wishing you a bright green day.